Is the American dream dying? That's a conversation you've heard me have before. But this one's not going to focus on immigrants. It's going to focus on Americans that are born here. It's going to focus on people who were raised here. It's going to focus on the people who are getting failed by the America that we were told to love. What are some of the biggest reasons why it's failing, and what are the ways we can fix it? That is what this conversation is about with my great guest, Nick Halaris. I hope you guys do enjoy this podcast episode. Welcome back to the Purple Political Breakdown. How's it going? How's your day been? We are back at it again. Ladies and gentlemen, today we got another excellent conversation and great podcast episode. As I have a great expert, I have a great guest to talk about not only the aspects of homelessness that I feel like do not get discussed quite often, but a more broader topic of like the American dream. I touched upon it a little bit in terms of last podcast episode. Make sure you guys go check it out, where we were debunking some of the biggest lies about immigration and illegal immigration in America. But the idea of the American dream is so core to who we're supposed to be or what we should be looking towards that it seems like it's not talked about, or at the very least, it might be dead altogether. So we'll talk about that. In order to have that great conversation, I have a guest here with my guy named Nick. So I'm going to allow him to introduce himself, tell everybody what he's about, where he comes from, his political background. Go for it.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate what you're trying to do with this show. I feel like one of the biggest problems in our society today is the sort of lack of sophisticated, rational, civil discussion among people interested in politics. And so any voice like you who's out there trying to prove that it's possible and provide the example, man, I really respect that. So thanks for doing what you do. My name is Nick Halaris. For everybody here who don't know me, I write a newsletter called Profit Plus and have my own podcast called The Nick Halaris Show. And what I've been writing and podcasting about are sort of how to be successful in this modern American world and life without compromising your integrity. And so I write about a lot of different things. I write about entrepreneurship and business and citizenship, but tying it all together is like, it's really trying to help people just navigate this complex world and find work that's meaningful and build a life with purpose. And so that's what I've been doing there. And my day job is I run a real estate company. I've been a real estate investor and developer for over almost 20 years now. And we're doing everything from building high-end apartments in West Hollywood and Los Angeles to recently we started helping families in the Palisades here in Los Angeles rebuild their homes and are going to be investing heavily in Palisades. So I don't know how far back you want me to go, but that's what I'm up to these days.
All right, fair enough. To kind of start, it is always important to kind of give a general layout, depending on how deep you want to go into it is completely up to you on like why you wanted to even start engaging in these type of conversations in the first place. Especially like doing real estate, all that stuff. Not only could it be a fruitful career, depending on like how good you are at doing that, but the other aspect is like going out of your way to build homes for people and going out of your way to have these conversations for people who are not achieving their best life, so to speak. So how did you get into this space? How did you get into talking about these type of conversations and advocating for these type of issues?
Yeah, it's kind of a long story, but I'll try to like give a brief overview. I appreciate this question because I do think it's important. I feel like actually one of the things I've discovered as a podcast host and as a writer is that for all the people out there who are on a mission, there's usually some really interesting story, deeply personal story about why that mission became so important to them. And uncovering that story, you kind of uncover the secret to that person's identity and the passion that they're bringing to the table, which is really interesting and inspiring in many ways. In my own case, I had been, I had a daily practice of writing in a journal going back to when I was like maybe 17 or something like that. It's a really long time. So I basically wrote to myself for thousands of days. And it was kind of going along in my career. It was always part of my daily process. It was like my sort of way of checking in with myself, my taking care of myself practice, along with some other things like physical exercise and whatnot. But it was really important. But I wasn't sharing my writing with anyone. And along the way in my business career, I got into some really stressful situations. I had a business that I had to basically break apart because I was partners with people that I wasn't aligned with from an ethical standpoint and a value standpoint. And that set off like 6 or 7 years of like really dark times for me and stressful times for me, right at the point in my career when I was supposed to be making the most money. Like I had set this whole thing up and was doing financially, it was doing great, but there was sort of fatal flaw in the business. And so that caused me to turn even more inward in terms of like, man, I really gotta, just to get through the stress, I had to try to learn a lot about myself. I was forced to learn a lot about myself and carried along, got myself out of this legal mess, started a new business and got myself back on the path of financial success. And thank God everything worked out. It's actually amazing looking back on it. Like I was able to kind of like navigate some crazy stuff and end up on the other side where my investors didn't lose any money. I didn't lose that much money other than the legal bills. Even the people that I was fighting with, they actually walked away as millionaires too. So like, there's really nobody got hurt in this stupid crisis that I got myself into, but I certainly learned a lot. And then I was had young kids in the house, and the COVID crisis hit. And at this time, I just so happened to be involved in a bunch of public work. So I was on a high profile homelessness commission in Los Angeles. I happened to be the PTA president of my kids' preschool. And what happened in that moment in March and April of that year, 2020, is that a lot people turned inward in a big way, and it kind of revealed like the ugly truth of what's going on in America in many ways, as I saw people abandon these community causes that I was a part of. And that's what really prompted me to actually publish the first article for Profit Plus. I actually wrote an article about the American dream and its importance and how it was fading. And I actually, when I originally wrote the newsletter, it had a different name. It was called Civic Dawn. And my idea behind the newsletter was like, man, we really need to, in this country, reestablish a sense of civic responsibility. That's the pathway to improving the democracy. And nobody's really talking about it. That was interesting to me back in 2020. And it's even more relevant today, where citizenship and civic responsibility are sort of the last things on people's minds. But to me, that's the key to righting the ship in America.
Fair enough. I do think there's a lot of intriguing things regarding what you're referring to, and I'm curious to touch upon it. Before we kind of get into the nitty gritty, what is like a hobby or something that is appealing to you that like the average person will like? I tend to ask this question for every guest purely because people need to realize that yes, politics can be very boring, sure, and it can be a very draining topic, but these are normal people having these conversations that like normal things. So, what's a hobby of yours?
Yeah. So one of the things that got me through all the challenging times of my life is I've been like a very disciplined, exercise person. And so for the last decade, I've been going to a CrossFit gym here in West Hollywood every day, basically at 6 a.m. And so I've logged, I don't know how many of these workouts, but thousands, and absolutely love it and push myself to the limit. And I've gotten hurt a few times just from overworking my body, but I really value this extreme physical discipline. There's something about it that's really mentally clarifying and really helpful to my mental health and that helps me, show up in the world the way I want to show up. And so whenever people ask me for advice, the first thing I'm asking back to them is questions around, what's your routine? What's your daily routine? Is there any place in there where you have an exercise routine? It doesn't have to be what I do. I happen to just love like pushing myself to the limit, but you got to do something. I really feel like it's a keystone habit that really is sort of the core. Like part of me believes you can't really be at your best without some kind of physical discipline. And so that's something I've spent a lot of time on. And recently I've actually even started to coach a little bit. I've led a couple classes of other parents. I'm trying to get my parent friends to get into this style of workout with me, and just love it.
I respect that. I respect that. I definitely been trying to get into the gym a lot. I've been pretty consistent for the last few months. So, I'm gonna be one of those people asking for advice. So, if you're looking at a beginner, because I don't do CrossFit, I do more like with just weightlifting, heavy lifting type stuff like that. But if you're going to talk to someone and they're going like, I'm really trying to increase my cardio, I'm really trying to shred up, I'm trying to get that six pack. Like, what is a good beginner CrossFit workout in your opinion?
Oh, good. Okay. That's an interesting question. So, number one, the reason why gyms like CrossFit do well, like the sort of secret genius of that sport, is that there's something about the group dynamic and the competitive nature of it that causes people to push themselves harder than had they just gone to a nice gym and worked out on their own. And so I've seen this, just with my own eyes so many times. I highly recommend that whatever you do it in a group. Ideally, like, don't be afraid to take the group classes, because you'll be surprised at how much harder you push yourself when you're given a challenge and there are other people around. So I actually spent much of my early adult life working out on my own, and look, there's some advantages to that. You can you can get into it if you're really fit, really mentally disciplined. You can push yourself, but there's nothing like social pressure to take you to the next level. But a good example of a workout, like a beginner one, would be to do something like this. Like, pick like four or five exercises. Let's say like burpees, push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, and air squats, right? So some basic fundamental human movement patterns. And then pick a rep scheme, like 10 or 20 of each. And then set a clock for 30 minutes and do that as many times as you possibly can. So let's say the rep scheme is 10. So do 10 burpees, 10 push-ups, 10 pull-ups, 10 sit-ups, 10 squats. Do it over and over and over again for 30 minutes and see how many you get. And that would be like a nice introduction to this type of extreme strength training workout. And you feel great afterwards. You might hate it for a little bit in the middle of it, but you'll feel great afterwards.
All right, yeah, I respect that. I respect that. It is very tough doing stuff like that. CrossFit, hit workouts, like you gotta really be locked in. It definitely takes a lot of mental discipline. With that said, let's start talking about the conversation at hand. I guess the first thing that I do think is appropriate to talk about is just the aspect of the American dream and really kind of branch off from there. And I do think this is a very, interesting and convenient conversation to have, considering the topic I had last week, as I mentioned before. But that was focused on people coming into the country, and the idea of the American dream is coming into the America and making a life for yourself. I do think this conversation can focus more so on the Americans in the country and the dream that they have from like being born as a citizen, or even just being nationalized as a citizen. So it's a different lens, but both very important in the aspect of the American dream. So the first question is, in your opinion, what do you think the American dream is?
Yeah, I mean, I was fully infected with the mythology of the American dream. My father's an immigrant from Greece, and he brought that with him, that energy with him, that spirit of what it's like to be an immigrant coming to this country. And I either inherited it or just sort of was infected by it, just living with him. And the American dream to me is a complex idea, but the core of it is that you are granted an opportunity to make something of your life. something, whatever that dream of yours may be. The opportunity is there, and it's viable, and that's the important part about it, is that it has to be viable, and it means different things to different people. People have tried to summarize the American dream as, the getting a home with a picket fence in the suburb, or making more money than your parents made. And to be sure, those are aspects of the American dream, but it's really about the individual's journey in life, and the opportunity to make of it what he or she will. That's what's so inspiring about America. That's what's unique about this place, as opposed to every other country in history, which had different aims. The aim of the American experiment was to support the individual's journey. And I feel like we've lost touch with that because we've tried to think of the American dream in much more limited terms.
What do you mean by limited terms? What are you looking at? Who are you looking at, and how are they are trying to change what it is currently?
Yeah, I think it changes for each generation. So, for example, like by the time you get to sort of my parents' generation, the American dream had been simplified into a very specific understanding. And the understanding was this: if you do X, Y, and Z, like you go to good schools, you get a college degree, and go work for a great American company, you will be financially successful. You'll be able to purchase a home in a nice neighborhood. Your kids will be able to go to good schools. And oh, by the way, you'll have healthcare, and you'll be taken care of in your retirement through your pension plans and your Social Security. That was the American dream as articulated to our parents' generation. The American dream today is manifesting in crazy ways, like to the extent that people even think about the American dream. It's like you can get rich by the time you're 25 and never work and fly private jets and this and that. It's gotten sort of like, it's turned into this extreme, selfishly oriented, materialistic vision of the American dream. And if you ask young people today, like the version that I just described to you that was so powerful for our parents' generation, they could care less about. No one believes that. No one even trusts a corporation to provide for them the kind of security that was provided for in the previous generation. So that version of the dream is dead, in the minds of young people, and maybe even in the minds of people, older people, as they see these companies like back away from their promises, as they see the deterioration of the fiscal situation and the possibility that things like Social Security and Medicare are getting cut. Like basically people are losing faith in the entire version of the American dream that was sold. And now people are searching for a new version.
Yeah, I do think that is a extraordinary problem in America, and that aspect kind of different from the conversation I had with my other guests, where it's like we can really focus on like certain policy and a very arrogant or more ignorant perception on immigrants. The aspect right now that we're talking about is more of a like cultural divide, or at the very least a loss of very particular values that are established at the ground level. And I do think there's a lot of factors that may play into it. I'm curious if you agree. One aspect I've talked about this before is that a lot of people who are young, I do think, are creating this kind of weird type of parasocial um, relationship with social media individuals. I think that is another the big one in terms of when they look at people. Young people are becoming successful, rich, showcasing their wealth, and they try to kind of characterize themselves as not a role model. But a role model is not something that you know become. That's something you are once you have a certain level of influence. And they see this and it's like, oh, I'm around that age. I could do that. Like everybody wants to become this. They just want to become an entertainer, or at the very least, they're seeing this joyful, luxurious life, and they can see themselves with that. I do think back in the day with like celebrities and the athletes and all that stuff, I do think there was a want to become there, but there is always a drive uh to that. It's a step by step process to kind of get there. Now anybody can turn on their computer and try to become a social media influencer, entertainer, or whatever. and and there's also a more of a feeling that I can become them. They're just like me. Whereas like these other people are seen as larger than life, superhero esque. It's I'm not gonna be like that. So that's not something that I'm gonna strive for. I do think there's a different level of like want of becoming successful because of the social media age, which has skewed people's idea of like joy, happiness, values, success, what it means to be worth something to the eyes of the young in today's day and age. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. It summarizes sort of the main cultural transmission failure of the American dream is exactly the way you describe it. Like the proliferation of social media in the last 10, 15 years has really impacted our culture in a negative way. These things were already in the works. Like I remember actually when I was younger, they had shows like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. And um, after a while, I remember MTV Cribs. And so people were getting a glimpse of this before social media, but then it just turned in it, like social media is like steroids for this type of energy.
Yeah.
And there's some positive to it. Like it's not completely a negative force for culture. The positive is that it breeds ambition in young people to be successful, but it's advertised in the worst possible way. It's just materialism on fire. People seeking status and materialism without regard of the consequences, and that's why we're seeing things like these fraud. I call them fraud cycles, but like with every boom, there's invariably a bunch of frauds, and so you saw it with the tech companies in the 2010 era, the crypto companies on more than one occasion. And I'm absolutely convinced there's a fraud cycle coming on the AI side, because
Yeah.
this draw to the money is so crazy. I mean, especially today, like you look at these AI valuations, we're talking like billions. The allure of getting your piece of that is so powerful that people just start breaking laws and stuff. And invariably, when the tide comes back, when the money recedes and the excitement's over, we're going to find out where the frauds are and where they're not. And that's one of the really like negative societal consequences of this energy that you described.
Yeah, I 100% co-sign AI. I do think it's a useful tool, but we are pushing that into people's faces, not because it's helpful for society. It's because it's going to make a lot of people a lot of money, and it's going to become problematic. Very, very similar to social media, arguably more so than social media, because of like the potential versatile aspects of AI that people are inclined to not only trust, even though AI has flaws in terms of information dissemination, but also the we think that it's parasocial to kind of look at social media content creators. There's people who would think that they can like literally create a relationship with AI. It is very problematic. I agree in regards to that for sure. And when it comes down to it, I guess the question would be, all right, how do we not necessarily fix that because it's such a complex situation that there's no one fixed solution, but how like mediate it, improve the current structure that currently exists. And I don't think it's going to be a policy thing. I don't think regulation's really going to change anything, but I do think it's going to be a dynamic that starts from instilling values at the home. And I tell everybody this, that you as a parent, you as a family, you're going to have to instill structure that social media can't run your child's life, and like what true values are, you're going to have to establish that in them. So that's one big key aspect that I think is going to be huge to kind of fix this, or at the very least help deal with this. What about you? What do you think? Do you think it's that, or do you think there's something else, or do you think that it's that plus more stuff?
Yeah.
Curious your thoughts.
Uh, First of all, I agree that that's a necessary component of the solution. Absolutely. Like this is all starts in the household, and it's an individual responsibility question. Whether you're going to engage with social media, or your family's going to engage with it in the right way, or engage with this energy, let's call it, because it's going to change. It doesn't matter what technology is. It's this selfish materialistic energy that is out there that is causing the problem. And I've thought a lot about this because, it's one thing to say like, oh, the American dream is under attack and we need to fix the American dream. And that sounds all interesting. It's just an interesting idea. And people in America have enough fluency with the emotional energy of the American dream to know what that means. But then you start thinking about like, okay, well, what if I was running for president? How would I articulate that in a way that's practical? And I actually think there's some very practical ways in which we could improve the policy landscape around the American dream, and get it back on track. And so here's kind of what I've been thinking about. I'd love to get your take on this. So, in my view, the American dream essentially was for American history was operating along three like vectors, right? There was housing, there was education, and there was economic mobility. And what's been happening in the last 40 years is that for all kinds of reasons, all three of those vectors or channels have gotten, messed up. And so like take housing, for example, something I'm very familiar with because it's what I do all day. Housing is a completely broken industry in this country, and it's completely blocked. New supply is being completely blocked all over the place by bad politics. And we've essentially forced ourselves into a housing affordability crisis because we've been unwilling to address these political failures. There's one it's in our control. We could absolutely solve the housing crisis. Education is something where, it's like one of America's greatest contributions to human history is the proliferation of mass education. And we've just, for all kinds of reasons, again, we let it just get worse and worse and worse right before our eyes, and we don't seem to care about it. And now it's manifesting in the craziest behavior, right? Like Operation Varsity Blues, like people paying and cheating to get their kids into college. Like it's a joke, right? So we've let education fall apart, and it's so expensive, and we have $1 trillion of student loans. And then finally, economic mobility. We live in this crazy time where, the numbers don't look good. This is the first time in a very long time in American history where it doesn't look like the next generation is going to do as well as the previous, and on the macro scale. And that's a huge problem because then it sets the generations. The reason it's problematic at the individual level because it's like depressing or putting young people in a position where they don't feel like they can thrive. And man, what is life if you can't feel like if you don't feel like you have a shot? And then it's problematic at a political level because it's created this generational conflict. And the generational conflict is essentially, we have all these people who lived under one regime of the American dream, the boomer generation. We've had boomer presidents for a very long time, people that are presidents way too old, right? This, in my view, this is a manifestation of the boomer generation hanging on for dear life to their version of the American dream. And it's to the detriment of the younger generations because they're just hoarding all the assets. They have all the stocks, they have all the homes, they have all the seats in Congress because we don't have term limits, and they've had the presidency for a very long time. And I think that's about to change, but it's set up this conflict, and this manifests all over the place. Like take education, for example, or the police force. The previous generations negotiated themselves these massive pension programs. And those pension programs are the exact thing that's standing in the way of schools getting better. The schools and police departments, they actually need the money that's promised to the older generation. They need it for the current service level. But it's become this political landmine that like no politician wants to talk about or address. But it's everywhere you look in American society. It's at Social Security, it's at Medicare, it's at police, it's at education. And it's created this really complex policy landscape where rather than deal with it, we let it stagnate. And it's in our failure to address that the American dream has become compromised.
Those three things, I do think Very potent. I definitely talk a lot about public education. It's one of my big issues with America. Is like I think our public education system is super flawed, for sure. And there's not only things that can be kind of optimized in terms of like what is being taught, but we kind of had the conversation in terms of instilling values. And there was a sense of idea that, school could help instill not like your complete moral structure and foundation, but certain principles and values, especially when understanding how to deal in social scenarios that you can get from schooling, as well as certain other just principles that you won't get from your parent, of course. Because you're spending like 8 hours a day, 5 days a week at those places. So you're going to learn a lot from schools. And it's just become it's just become unfortunate. Not only the things where I feel like we're learning in schools are becoming more and more irrelevant in terms of public education. There's a definitely like deep seated divide between students and teachers. I think that has been growing with a certain level of like I don't know, not only students and teachers and families too, might I say. And it seems like there's a level of like respect that not be there, a level of connection that might be there, my level of dissociation of I'm not there to mold the next generation who are going to be the foundation of America. I'm just here to do my job and get out here and leave. And that also plays into not only treatment but also pay and resources and sources. I always thought that teachers were underpaid for sure. So the education is flawed. Economic mobility, you kind of laid it out. I've never heard the stuff about pensions, but I do think that's a very interesting point because I've heard the talking point about like how a lot of like the wealth, and this also plays into all the housing stuff, and we'll kind of that's probably where the meat of this conversation because that's your expertise. But like how the older people have not only all the spots in political office, but all the money as well, and they're not giving it up to the young people. And there's a lot of opportunity for young people, or all the opportunity for young people to kind of take advantage of that. All those people are looking at social media and the internet to make a life instead. So they're just doing what they got to do. They're paying attention to these other aspects of like wealth accumulation, and all the kids are looking at, and all the kids, teenagers, young adults are looking at social media to create a career. There's a weird little divide. I don't know if it's intentional or not, that is getting created in addition to certain programs, as you mentioned before. So, with that said, let's focus on like the housing, because I do think these 3 points were very very potent. I do think they're important, but the housing stuff, that is definitely something that I have not talked about in depth. I don't. It's interesting because we've been talking about housing for like years right now. How housing and homes. The only time people felt really good in terms of like buying a home was during COVID, where like the interest rates were like down in the ground and people were buying homes. Like, oh yeah, we're about to eat off of this. But regardless, there has been a lot of talk about homes and not people not being able to afford a home, and what we do about that. So I'm curious on your thoughts on this current like housing crisis we're having right now.
Yeah, it's a really big deal. It's a big deal for the American dream. It's a big deal for the functioning democracy. And in my view, it's the largest but least spoken about political issue in the American landscape. You hear a little bit about it in the national debates, like when there's a presidential election, you're hearing a little bit about it out of the Trump administration about how they want to focus on housing. But man, it's a humongous problem. Depending on what estimates you look at, there's like estimated 3 to 6 million unit shortage of housing in the country. We have extreme situations in places like Los Angeles where there's so little affordable housing that there's like 600,000 households that are spending over 70% of their monthly income on rent. And so, man, you spend 70% on rent, like you're like one bad day away from becoming homeless.
Yeah.
And so it's manifesting in this Frankenstein situation and not Frankenstein. I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but it's like a have and have not, especially in the cities. If you happen to own a home in Los Angeles, you enter a new channel of wealth, because the value of your home just keeps going up and up and up, and actually ends up, for most families, becoming their most significant asset. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But if you don't own a home, you're left out of that channel. And so it's binary. It's like you either own or you don't own. And people are starting to feel differently about America and about American policy and politics, depending on where they land. And so if you rewind the clock to the George W. Bush administration, they famously inflated the largest residential real estate bubble in recent American history. There's been many of these bubbles, but this was the largest one. And there were many reasons. It wasn't just the Bush administration, but President George W. Bush was focused on what he was calling the ownership society. And they were out, in the State of the Union talking about, the home ownership rate in America just ticked up to 65% or something like that. I forget the exact number. And then the bubble burst and dropped back down to like 60%. So America's like 60-40, 60% homeowner, 40% renter. And there are places around the world that have way higher percentages than that. So like Singapore, for example, has like a 90+% home ownership ratio. And they had all kinds of innovative policies that involve government intervention to get them there. And so America is actually not even doing that great on the home ownership front. But if you go around and you ask Americans, young Americans, what they want, they absolutely want a home. And so what you saw during the COVID era, you mentioned the COVID time, the COVID period was like a perfect, emotional, predictable response to that level of insecurity in the world. It showed exactly what Americans want. Americans want housing. And there was a brief moment in time when interest rates were so low and work flexibility, the economic mobility, one of the other elements of this looked like it was coming back into play. And people were like, yes, I can move and buy a house. And they did it in droves. And then inflation set in, rates ticked up. And now we're facing one of the worst housing markets that we've had since that crash that I mentioned in 2006, 2007. So it's a humongous problem, and it's a self-inflicted wound. I'll stop there, and we can maybe get into why it's a self-inflicted wound, but just don't want to just keep talking and talking.
No, you're good. It is a crazy situation that we have in right now, and every time like I hear people talk about it, and I like when I'm watching the elections, the conversation on like housing, even though you hear mummers of like people talking about I can't buy a home, I'll never have a home. Like I have personal friends that are talking about like, oh man, we want to get a different home. Um, but when it comes to the politicians, there's like one question that is asked about housing, nothing satisfying in terms of an answer. One thing I did hear is like, from Kamala is like build more homes. But even that question, like it seems like a simple politics is supposed to see, like when you do elections, you're supposed to make it as simple as possible. But I'm more interested in like the application of like how this is going to work. And building more homes seems like an interesting answer, but it's obviously not that simple because they're not doing it. And then there's the other aspect of how do we feel about the big wigs, the big institutions, the firms that are buying up these homes? They are buying them in droves. So why is it not that simple of just like building more houses? What is preventing that for to happen in America?
Yeah, this is a great question. And again, it shocks me that people don't talk about this. Maybe it's just because it requires like a little bit of research and understanding of how democracy actually functions. But this particular issue, engaging with it, has really opened my eyes about something. It's a very uncomfortable truth that I've discovered, and it's going to sound maybe hyperbole, but I really believe it. Like, we talk about America as a democracy, but let me tell you, the underbelly of America is not functioning in a very democratic way at all. We have a complete failure of democracy at the local level, all across the country. And the reason we have a failure is not because someone's trying to take it over. It's actually the opposite. It's an apathy crisis. No one is paying attention to local politics. People that in here in Los Angeles, for example, like I live in a district where I have like 27 elected positions that I can vote for. There is nobody in my neighborhood besides me who knows anything about anyone who's ever been in one of those positions. So we have this really weird scenario where there's voting happening in local elections, but no one knows what they're talking about. No one even knows what the candidates stand for. They go down their ballot list. They may know a little bit about the presidential candidates and the people running for Senate, Congress, and governor. Like there's a few positions that people pay attention to, but then you get down into state representative, state senate, local city council, local mayor. Nobody has a clue. Nobody has a clue. And so what ends up happening is that people get elected and they don't have the will of the majority in mind. They have the will of the people who got them elected in mind. And that happens to be here in Los Angeles, for example, that happens to be two types of groups: highly organized unions and rich people. That's basically what it is. No one else is paying attention. And so as a result of this fundamental failure, this really like awful dynamic has emerged in big cities in particular, but I've seen this actually in places that you wouldn't expect to see it, like Georgia and Texas, where NIMBYism, which stands for not in my backyard, essentially has complete control over the development conversation for each neighborhood. And NIMBYism is a strange phenomenon because it's not a partisan. It's really skews on this question of like, are you a homeowner or not? If you're a homeowner, I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican, you're most likely in Los Angeles going to be NIMBY. You're going to oppose every development that comes across. And I've seen it. I've seen it with my own eyes. And so there's this crazy political phenomenon where the NIMBYs work together with increasingly leftist, anti-capitalist politicians to enact an agenda, a policy agenda that makes it really hard to develop new housing. And so it's this crazy coalition of people that don't really actually politically align, but they align on this one specific thing, which is, hey, let's block that apartment that got proposed on the next door street. Let's block that together. And boom, over and over and over again, the NIMBYs are winning. And there's been some attempts, like here in California, there's been some attempts to usurp this power dynamic by bringing the state and the power of the state to bear against local government. And I'm a part of a couple groups like YIMBY Action. People who are interested should look up this organization. It's one of the most effective civic advocacy organizations in the country. YIMBY Action has done a phenomenal job of using the state legislature and the governor to try to usurp these local power dynamics, and it's working. It's like what happened to housing is sort of death by a thousand cuts, and so the fight back has been, trying to get 1,000 band-aids. So there's been a lot of little policy wins, and even some big ones here recently in California, like the governor just signed into law a really big one. We can get into that if you want, but that's what's been going on.
That is very interesting and very correct. I mean, I heard this story from one of my guests before, and they were talking about how when it comes down to this like new, I think it was like a traffic light or a stop sign on this random road, and then there's this one lady, old lady. She was very annoyed. She didn't like it. She didn't like this new traffic light. So what she did is she went to City Hall basically every day until they got rid of it. They eventually got rid of it. And it just shows you that when it comes to local politics, there is an assumption to people in general that nothing I do matters when it comes to government. And I try to repeat constantly, consistently. I wouldn't go as far as like nothing matters, but I will say for the most part, when it comes to what the federal government is doing, your individual, like what you say, more than likely is going to have no impact. However, if you are an advocate in your local community, you have so much power, you have so much influence to change things. And I tell people all the time, what is more important is local politics for your individual need. If you want something changed, you should care more about what's going on in your community, in your city, in your state. It was supposed to be states first, but eventually maybe it's the addition of media that really created presidents as a personality. And I do think there might be, I'll talk about the social media thing in a second, we might be able to kind of use that in our advantage when it comes to the local stuff. But yeah, I think for the most part, the people who have all the influence are the people who actually pay attention to local politics, and there are not a lot of people who actually do. But if you do, you can create a union, you can advocate, you can get signatures. Most people sign stuff. I'm gonna be honest, you just gotta convince them, and they'll sign it, and you can do a lot. And of course, the rich people. And then what you said about the homes, I've heard this before, that the people who have homes don't want all these changes. It's like you're just gonna you might ruin the value of my home depending on what you build here, right? So if people who want homes, like the people who don't have homes, who want homes, but they're not advocating for more homes, then the people who are gonna have the influence are the people who have homes and don't want you changing anything. It is a kind of skewed process, but to kind of touch upon what I said before, and then we'll kind of go into a little deeper in terms of like, I'm curious about what NIMBY action does and maybe the bill you're talking about and more specific things. Obviously, the common sense stuff in terms of like local politics is being more in tune, be more educated, be more informed. Like these are obvious things that anybody could tell you. Whether or not you do it's completely up to you. When it comes down to the average person, I do treat them a little differently. So I have to like, how do I appeal to this person? I think it could be potentially argued that one potential positive is that social media could be that outlet. And I've criticized social media, but I've always said there's pros and cons. One of the pros you can say is that someone as an individual can have a lot of influence. And something I think a good comparison is I'm sure I don't know if you're on TikTok or IG Reels or whatever. You've seen the food reviewers though. Like you've seen clips of those people
Sure.
going out to restaurants
Yeah.
and creating like a lot of buzz for the local restaurant, like then getting like people to go over there. I mean, that same principle can be applied to your local politician. And I do think that social media can be used in a way to really create more education and noise for your local politics and local media, local politician personalities that's going on and things going on in your community. Obviously, it needs to like people need to kind of get to it and lock in for that. It's kind of the same thing as like it can help with like third party candidates, for example, and it's doing a lot in terms of educating young people in terms of politics more so than ever before. More young people are becoming more advocates. And obviously there's pros and cons to that as well because of like radicalism. But ultimately, there might be a way to help with this stuff with like more social media attention because mainstream media will never cover this stuff and most people don't have cable to watch like local news, and a lot of local news cover like, hey, this terrible thing's happening anyway. So I think that could be one way to help with the like local attention, paying attention to your area, in addition to like obviously people telling other people, hey, this is going on. But curious on like, what do you think? Because I'm sure you have more thoughts on like what is the better way to really get people to pay attention and advocate and being more informed.
Yeah. It's a tough question because there's a part of me that thinks like, man, why are we even pretending? Why are we pretending? Why are we lying to ourselves that we have a democracy at local politics or even state politics or even federal? Like the comedians, from time to time, I forget which night show did this, but they would go on the street and ask people questions about like America, basic 101 stuff. And man, the answers are wild. People that don't know anything about American politics or American history or American government. And if you take a step back, like, and ask yourself a meta question, like, well, does it make any sense? Like, if if people actually don't know what they're talking about, do we really trust their votes? And that brings you to like a different line of thinking. It's sort of a darker line of thinking because, obviously I don't want to sit here and advocate for like some other form of government that doesn't give people the right to vote. But at the same time, I cannot help but question, is it rational? Is it rational to pretend that we have a democracy when people don't know what they're talking about? And I think the answer is clearly no. And I see it in the way that politics manifests at the state and local level, and even at the federal level. Like the absurdity that we've seen in American politics is a direct function of the fact that the American citizenry doesn't know what the heck it's talking about. And there's various degrees. Everyone, is not guilty of this disengagement, but there's a profound level of disengagement with serious political and civic discourse. People have the slightest clue of what they're talking about in most cases. And on complex issues like housing and education and economic mobility and the deficit and gun violence, like pick what you want, pick whatever headline comes in the news. If you go around and you poll Americans and test their level of understanding of what's possible and not possible in the American Constitution, you'd be really like depressed with the answers. And so it's tough. And it's like the fix, it feels like, is to say, well, people need to be more engaged. And it's easy to say that, but it's much harder to get them to do that. And so I am in favor of the idea of trying to get people actually to turn their attention away from the national scene and focus local, because to your point, which you mentioned earlier, like it actually, you feel empowered when you engage in local government. You actually feel empowered because you can make a difference. What you realize when you do local government is that you're dealing with people, and people can be influenced. You can convince them to change their policy position. If you get enough convincing arguments, or if you get enough people in the neighborhood to say, hey, we need a stop sign here, like that person will listen to you. And that's actually how democracy is supposed to work. And we just got to get people back in that mindset, and we need to get them en masse. And I've thought about ways to do that. Like a couple of my ideas that I have that maybe could kind of fix the citizenship problem or the apathy problem is a national service requirement. So it could be military, but like maybe everybody when they turn 20 should do a year of service in a local nonprofit, local government, or the military, as a way to strengthen their ties with community. The other one I'm a huge fan of is kind of a crazy policy. People would think I'm crazy for saying this, but I think we should have term limits for Congress and Senate. And at the same time, we should massively increase the pay. So we should make it basically like $1 million a year if you make it, so that the talented Americans who are like looking at like, hey, I could be a partner at a law firm and make 7 figures, or work at Goldman Sachs, or work at OpenAI. They need a viable alternative, and $170,000 a year at Congress is not a viable alternative for the best and brightest. And so those are just a couple of my ideas on a high level on how we could begin to shift the culture towards accepting this democratic responsibility.
So when it comes to the higher pay, I actually agree to that. I've spoken about this before, that they probably should get paid more considering everything that they do, and also make all the money that's coming into them more transparent, so you can do both: higher pay, more transparent in terms of any other money that they may getting in from other sources. But I think that is very important because there's not a lot of incentive to be in politics. Like, sure, you might get paid like this amount of money, not everybody gets paid 6 figures from my knowledge, but there's so much BS that comes with also being in politics, and so much hatred and vitriol, and currently the divisive nature. Now your life is on the line. It's not an easy job for the amount of money you are getting, and these are the people running the world, basically, because if you run America, you run the world, let's be honest. So when it comes down to it, this is too important a position for you not to get like compensated a lot and not have to worry about anything else. So I agree. I think they should be higher paid, but also more restrictions. With that said, the advocacy national service thing is interesting. I feel like the best way to implement that is implementing it with schooling, because in school, for the most part, people volunteer, and usually they volunteer for a reason, right? They might have to volunteer to get into, like, I had to volunteer to get into the National Honor Society, for example. Other people may have to volunteer for college. Like, a lot of people volunteer for college. That's actually a very big one. So just having that other aspect of, like, oh yeah, just do this for, some service, I do think can be interesting. I don't know how else you would implement it if it's not attached to, like, public schooling. And I
Mhm.
think that also could be, you also can get credit. You also can get, like, obviously it can appear on your college application. Like, there is ways for that to kind of seamlessly be a part of, and especially young people, as they get used to and understand government and, like, what's going on in their community. But I do think those are big things, and I do get black pilled when it comes down to people and not understanding things. Like, when I create my content and do my podcast and put out my clips, I don't truly engage with the comments. I just be trolling. I'm not gonna lie, because, like, if I do, what's the point? I just don't. They just don't understand how this stuff works, which is fine. Another thing that
Here's the question:
oh, go ahead.
Is it really fine? Is it really fine? That's the
Oh,
question.
no, it's not fine at
I've been
all.
asking myself, like the volunteer thing. I just want to close, follow up on that. Like,
Mhm.
I think what Americans need to understand is that this is not a volunteer thing. This is a requirement, and citizenship is requires work. And literally, like, generations. If you could go back in time and go to people who lived in 150 years ago or 200 years ago and say, like, what would you give to have political freedom? Man, they would give their lives, right? And we're just like, we're too busy making money to even give a crap. And to me, that is it's like a dereliction of a fundamental sacred duty. And we're seeing it en masse. Like, the vast majority of the American population is not fulfilling their democratic responsibility. And
I
that's,
agree to
yeah.
that. I agree to that. However, I have to be practical with current Americans. And I just know if you tell them do this, they're like, no, they're just not going to do this. So you have to do it in a way where it makes it seem like they want to do it. That's just how it has to be. And you could say it's like manipulative or whatever, but it is also a good thing. Even when it's a good thing, you have to make people nowadays think that this good thing is something they want to do. And that's kind of just the biggest concern, because, like you said, a lot of people are focused on themselves. There's a lot of other issues that is also attached to, like, this kind of other selfish need that you brought up in the beginning of the podcast. Like, the family is dying, birth rates are dying. Like, there are so many aspects of, like, things that were core in terms of, like, establishing a society that are all just, like, dying, because of these, like, values that are not being kind of adopted in generations to come. So you gotta put them up to set them up for success, and then eventually gotta hope that they open their eyes into, like, the best things, not only for themselves but also for the society they're living in, because a good society is also good for yourself. Like, you can make it as selfish as you want, because you live in the society that you're currently living in. So you have to kind of appeal to them. And the two examples that I'm gonna look at that I think embody this, but also showcases that there is a potential framework, but it needs to kind of be, like, done in a like non-nefarious way, is the man Donald Trump, which I'm not a fan of, but I just got to be honest. His politics, like his ability to appeal to, like, 50% of Americans, is undeniable. And then Zoran Mondami. I don't know how familiar you are with Mondami in New York right now, but I think those two offered very interesting things. One, they made themselves very present. They appealed to the people as individuals and really adhered everything they were saying to what they want to hear. I wouldn't go as extreme as Trump, because he basically, like, created, like, a lot of propaganda, but I think even Mamdani kind of he went very similar. And I don't believe in populism. I want to be very clear, but in populist type rhetoric, to appeal to the individuals and make them not only care about, oh, we might actually do something, but this is the first time in a long time where so many people around the world cared about a mayoral election. Now, to be fair, the New York mayor's office it's probably the most important mayoral office in America. Regardless, though, nobody's care. We have never talked about a mayoral office ever. Now, when Adams or other guy's name, I forgot the other guy's name, Cuomo, were trying to, like, we didn't care about them trying to run. We care about Mamdani, though, because of how he's connecting or resonating with the people. So not only could we do like certain these policy changes that could help, not only could we enact certain marketing strategies with like social media or just like families really establishing these values, but the politicians themselves need to also make themselves known more in their local area as much as possible. So the people have a civic duty. I 100% agree. These politicians also have a civic duty to really connect to the people in your area, especially the people who don't care about politics. They're even more people than people who already care. So I think that's the last kind of piece of the puzzle for this conversation.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And what struck me as you were talking about that is that if you look at the case of Trump, President Trump, or this Mamdani, who's not quite won mayor, right? Still, that's still ongoing.
Yeah, it's like 85% chance he's gonna win though.
Yeah. In both of those instances, what's fascinating to me as a student of history is that here are politicians who are appealing to Americans with a message of, all you got to do is put me in office and I'm going to solve your problems for you. And it's appealing. Look, I get it. I understand emotionally what's happened in these two elections. And I understand how you could be interested in the ideas, some of the ideas that were spouted, off by both of these individuals. But contrast that to great American presidents. Contrast that to presidents like Lincoln or FDR. These are presidents who used their political power, used their charisma to call upon Americans to make sacrifices. Mm. It's a different way of leadership. And yeah, maybe you could argue like times were more serious, the Depression and the Civil War, but that's what distinguishes this generation of politicians from the ones that we look upon as heroes. And so I'm looking for politicians to step up with a different message. Not that I'm some magic pill that's going to solve your problem. It's that we are going to work together and we're all going to have a shared sacrifice. And here's what the shared sacrifice looks like. But at the end of that, we're all going to be better off. Like, that's the kind of politician I'm interested in seeing emerge onto the field.
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely what we need nowadays. There's too much kind of divisive politics right now, and it's more like there is a level of, okay, get involved. I mean, we saw a crazy event. It might have been in the month of January where people got involved, but we do need someone to kind of bring us together. And I don't think, I know for a fact it's not happening in this administration, but hopefully moving forward, someone does kind of establish that and get people to kind of be more accountable and be more active and become bigger advocates as well. And also, probably the hardest thing is you're also gonna have to really get those people that have a lot of money, that 1%, that 0.01%. You got to get them in line as well. So there's a lot of tough things. Were you about to say something?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's actually one of the things I've been writing about. Like, the biggest failure of all in terms of civic responsibility is the elite. The American elite is like asleep at the wheel, and they're heading headlong into a disaster that's going to impact them, probably the most, because you can't, if you have that kind of privilege, you can't just sit back and let your country suffer. You got to step up. You either have to step up and become a leader yourself, or you have to be a moral authority, or you have to use your financial resources to make America better, period. And so the failure of the American elite is, man, we could talk for another hour about that. But I'm glad you brought that up, because it's sort of like the first place that I would look. Like I look around the room, like these are people who in many cases are some of the most capable people on planet Earth. People who know how to organize large scale organizations and systems and whatnot, people who started companies, became CEOs. Man, those are the type of people we need to address these societal problems. And they're over there, building yachts and living their life. And so, well, there's a consequence for that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe going to Mars will solve all our problems.
There you go.
Maybe that's going to solve all our problems. Well, that's all we got for today's podcast episode. I thought this was a very, very good conversation to talk about, the American dream, the homelessness problem, some of the biggest issues we have in regards to America right now. Do you have any final words? Anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
No, just Riddell, thanks so much for having me on the show. I really enjoyed this conversation. Like I said, I love what you do. People can find me online. My newsletter that I mentioned earlier is free. You can sign up. I'd love to have you, and please engage. I reply to everyone who emails me, and just love to hear what people have to say about this.
All right, excellent. All this information should be in the podcast description once this comes out. Really appreciate everybody who's listening. Make sure you guys rate the podcast 5 stars. If you do, share with your friends and family. You'll have a good one. Take care and peace.